Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Every 2 years, the OECD presents its flagship publication on measuring well-being. Today, the 2015 edition is being launched. The presentation will be made by the 2015 edition of How's Life, the flagship publication for measuring well-being, is being launched today as we speak. Secretary General Angel Gurria will make a presentation. He's joined on the podium by Martine Durand, the Chief Statistician of the OECD. After the presentation, I will give priority to questions from the media. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to be in Mexico. I am honored to be in La Perla Tapatía in Guadalajara to present the third edition of one of the most important studies of the OECD, the so-called How's Life, or in Spanish, ¿Cómo va la vida? How's life? As I was mentioning this morning during the plenary session, that if we were asked how's life, we could give you one of these heavy books. But not only that, but also to give you one in particular that has to do, for example, on how's life in Mexico, because we do this for each country. We have a national chapter for each member countries, plus a set of countries that we call key partners. So, namely Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, among others that we are following the steps of with these indicators. By the way, we have a national chapter in Spanish and in English, and I would recommend that when reading about Mexico, you read the national chapter because it has recent information. The book has restriction with respect on when it goes to printing, when is information ready, but this has more flexibility. It is like a booklet and has more recent information on Mexico. I wish to congratulate Martine Durand and all the people of her team because producing a study like this third edition is highly revealing as we move forward in time and as we move forward in each and every published edition with each of the small tiny details along the way as we go deeper and deeper in this effort. We've experienced 7 years of crisis already, and all governments are focusing on growth, on how to regain growth in some cases, how to keep the pace of growth in some other cases. The time has come for recovery, for rethink some of our economic precepts, and it's the right time to ask, why do we want to grow for? Because we need to acknowledge that growth is not an aim on its own. It is the means to improve the well-being of our people and of our society, as we've heard time and again this morning. At the OECD, when we ask ourselves how's life, in Mexico or elsewhere, priority we are aiming at is that progress goes beyond the GDP. And of course, the growth of GDP is very important. I mean, let's not be confused. The GDP, of course, is a piece of information that is very important. The GDP per capita tells us about the behavior and the evolution of society, but it is by no means the only piece of information. So here we are talking about a new way of measuring the behavior of society with a more sophisticated tool. with, as I was saying, a GPS, a geographic positioning signal to allow us to measure growth and the well being of people. And the development of this GPS has never been as necessary as today. So now that we are talking about the SDGs and now that we are approaching the date for the UN Conference on Climate Change this coming December, the world is calling for effective measures, broader measures that reflect the impact of our policies, of our economies, and that impact that it has on the main factors of life, from well-being to the environment. This edition of House Life provides us with necessary evidence with respect to well-being across 9 dimensions of quality of life that has been gathered all the way from 2011, 13, and 2015, every other year, and that encompass objective measures with respect to employment and income, just how many people have employment or have income, environment, balance, life quality balance, life balance, how do people feel about their own life, and assessment, of course, that is highly personal, very intimate. We are not talking about nationwide averages. I mean, that comes after thousands or millions of people have made a personal evaluation or assessment and can actually, we can have these broader averages nationwide. This edition of House Life provides us with the initial steps to reflect upon the main aspects that we might call a relationship of well-being.
Besides objective measures, there's also questions about behavior and education that have to do with emotional aspects, social aspects, or capability to link with other parts of society in order to have initiative, to be generous, to be solidary, to work in teams. All of these qualities that do not necessarily are taught traditionally at the classroom and obviously should be incorporated at present, and that we are trying to measure precisely in order to identify the deficits and how we can fulfill those deficits on these topics. There was a person that told me when I arrived here that he hoped that I would mention the topic on volunteering and the importance of volunteering on society, life. And I would also like to tell you that a part of what we measure are precisely the willingness of voluntary work, as well as the level of confidence with which we face life, confidence on institutions, confidence in our democracy, confidence in our public servants, confidence in institutions as Congress, multinationals, banking systems, international bodies. That is to say, confidence in human beings, on others, on the other person that needs to be supported by us. And quite frankly, not astonishingly, we see that all those that have more confidence on others and on themselves are the ones that undertake more voluntary work tasks. So we're talking about how to link all indicators of quality of life. This effort gives continuity to our jobs, to reflect factors as social support, civic commitment, to what extent do we participate on civic efforts from the involvement in our communities and involvement in electoral processes and participate as candidates on the electoral processes. I can highlight three of the conclusions or the findings. First, the study incorporates a new section on children's well-being. How's life? In this specific case, on this edition, it reveals to us that children are paying a very high price because of the growing inequality. 1 out of 7 children on the OECD country members, and we're talking about the most prosperous countries worldwide, 1 out of 7 lives in poverty conditions, and 1 out of 10 belongs to families that are out of jobs, where none of the members of the family is receiving an income or having a formal job. Since very early age, the children for poorest families report worse health conditions, less satisfaction vis-a-vis life, more school bullying, and weaker relationships, less intense with their peers, as well as with their parents. There have been progresses. These topics have been put into the table of public policies discussion not so long ago. But the progress made is not yet enough. In the long run, it is not fair. Neither is feasible from economic viewpoint to condemn children from the least favored families to live in worse conditions than their peers that have more resources from other children that are much more fortunate in life. We need to be working more to break the cycle, because bad results will not only go from one generation to another, which is a denial of concept of development. They also influence in many other spheres of life. A second conclusion or finding among others from this study of house life highlights the function that the volunteer work can perform in order to improve the life of volunteers on one side, as well as those of the persons that they help. Volunteering is an important pillar of civic involvement in many of the OECD country members. In average, 1 out of 3 individuals at the OECD on the populations of the country members of OECD works as volunteer through an organization at least once a year. These activities contribute importantly to the individual's well-being, but they do not appear on our economic statistics. We started to make calculations. If we assign a value to the time that individuals invest on volunteering, if we assign a rate like labor rate, it accounts for 2 point of the country members of the OECD. Impressive. Sometimes when you change 0.2, 0.3, we make huge legislative changes and we make political efforts. And here we're talking about a quality that's worth over 2% of the size of our economies, which is the willingness of individuals to work in favor of those that are least fortunate. Unfortunately, not everybody enjoys these benefits. Unfavorable groups of unemployed or low income individuals are much more aside or apart from civil society. They have less confidence on others and on the institutions that are there to help them. They doubt greatly of the possibility of the institutions of governments of being capable of solving their personal problem, their individual problem. And as I have said, these individuals have less willingness to get involved in voluntary work. And the result is that we all lose because the economical unfavorable individuals are excluded from the benefits that result from activities that allow us to improve our societies and shape our societies. It is a great opportunity that is lost. That is telling us that for inclusive society, you need much more that simply solve inequalities on income. It is also important to recall that the well-being that the individuals lose and communities lose is not evenly distributed among countries. This leads me to my third finding that I wish to share with you, that is regarding well-being. Regardless of the relative income or GDP rate, there's no country that has it all. This edition on House Life shows that the region where an individual lives has a great influence on the opportunities to live better. Differences on well-being inside a country individually can be as large as the differences among countries. And I will give you an example on education. We have Monserrat Comendio, which is our Deputy Director on Education. Not long ago, Secretary of State on Education in Spain. Here in Mexico, in the capital city, Mexico City, 58% of the labor force concluded their middle education. This is comparable to the one that they have in Spain, even higher than that of Portugal. Yes, some areas of Mexico have indicators on this specific topic on education as good as any other country in middle of the table of income in Europe. But in Chiapas, the percentage is not 58%, it's 27%, it's more than half. One of the lowest rates of any of the country or regions of the OECD countries. We also see that there is a lower involvement rate on Italy. The gap between the highest involvement and lowest involvement rate has a difference as large as the national differences between Greece and Switzerland, which are quite large. So here we are talking about phenomena that have to be addressed at a regional level in order to solve the national inegalities, at the same time that we are approaching topics of inegalities amongst countries. What does this mean for public policies? Once and over again, all panel members that what they have been saying is measure in order to be able to decide, measure in order to act, measure in order to improve the conditions of the citizenship. Not measure just for measuring, nor to create statistics or to say that we know, but measure in order to see what we will be doing according to what we know. That is what we are trying to discuss on this forum, the 1,300 individuals that have come from all around the world here to debate on discuss on these topics. So I would tell you that when you see these results, I insist, these results come out on average from the most prosperous countries of the world, of each of the countries, and those of Mexico are presented separately. We see the importance of extending our notion of what we consider as prosperity. When we ask how's life, we highlight that we want to rethink our growth model because we are not content with the results obtained. We cannot allow ourselves to go in the development quest if we don't see who's going to get the benefit of that development, which effects it will have on the environment, or how that will impact one family versus another, or if it will have an impact on the teenagers, on the elderly, or on women more than any other group. But history cannot and should not end here. We need to make sure that the findings of this study will become public policy actions. That is what I was saying. This is the ultimate purpose. This is the reason of being of these results, while incorporating the well-being statistics to the analysis that we normally undertake on other topics. We overlay this statistics of well-being. We just presented in our report, All Aboard, how to make it possible to have an inclusive growth. That is one of the most important projects of works, as we call horizontal works, where we have several directorates of the OECD involved, several committees of the OECD work in it, and that we are coordinated from the General Secretary that we have. We are giving here the coordinator, this is Kamal. And because I was telling you, if we only measure the most obvious things, but we do not overlay the statistics of well-being like the layer that will be filtering all the others, statistics, we could not reach proper public policies. I see Stefano Scarpetta here, our head of employment, of work, labor, and social affairs, that precisely, along with Martin, but with our Department of Economy and our Department of Science and Technology and Innovation, they are all participating in this common effort. I would tell you that what we are trying to do here, and we are achieving it every time more and more as we learn along the way, because we are bringing or reducing the border of how we manage recommendations on social matters, how we can develop recommendations to improve well-being, how to foster access to quality education, and how to ensure that children have holding a diploma, they will really obtain the necessary skill and tools to become successful. Today, several of the panel members were saying quality education. They were adding quality to the education, which is a very important requirement nowadays. Inclusive growth policies should also be centered in improving the quality of employment, not only quantity, and promote what we call a better quality of life. Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, if we can measure it, I'm not sure that it's better. But if we can measure it, we can manage it. If we can measure it, we can manage it. If we can measure it, we can improve it. We have improved many of our measurement methods. We have tried to improve our own way of doing things inside the OECD. So now we are better prepared to do things better in our responsibility vis-a-vis society, which recommendations we are going to forward to society at the end of our works. Tomorrow, for example, it's tomorrow, right? We already have a child from the works on house life. This is the father or the mother, I don't know, the parent. To be politically correct, I should say it's the mother, because the child is measuring well-being on the states. Here we have the Mexican states. That's the offspring of the work that we have carried out. And this will be presented tomorrow. And we will go to measurement at a domestic level. In my presentation this morning, I was saying that 120 million inhabited, 2 million of square kilometers with all the federated entities. We have seen the huge gaps that they're existing between one and the others. We need a much more specific mapping than the great national averages. If asking how's life is just the first step, it is a decisive step. The 11 dimensions of well-being that are covered by the report, the factors that will be sustaining it throughout time, not only on the day of the report, but permanently, give us a wider image of what the true condition of human beings is. It is about a powerful instrument of communication between society and its leader. Once again, it's not statistics. We're not talking about figures. We're not talking about data. Just imagine that we have moved forward so much in this discipline, that is to be able to collect from society what takes their sleep away, what their demands, and where they are unsatisfied. So instead of going out on the street, demonstrating with timeliness, the authorities can identify, react, and adjust their service offer. So we can fulfill those demands that within time will be changing, obviously. Society becomes much more demanding, has much more information, but to the extent that development grows, and we can give more satisfaction to society, the society will be moving according to the demands. Take into account that they already have the basic satisfiers that have been already fulfilled, and it will be moving forward. Therefore, it is a powerful instrument of communication between society and authorities and the political leaders as well. Now governments will be able to use this evidence. What for? To achieve what we consider that is the best definition of the mission that the OECD has in order to promote, design, and eventually make reality better public policies for a better life. Thank you very much.
Vamos.
Now, I will sit back there. So if you have questions or you have violent objections, and of course, the tough questions will be answered by Martin, and I will answer the rest.
Could raise your hand clearly so the microphone person can see you. So any questions from the press, please?
Sí, buenas tardes, Antonio Hernández de...
I am Antonio Hernandez from El Universal. Mr. Gurria, could you please give us a little more details on this house life study in Mexico and whether what you mentioned regarding Mexican children, did you find any particular factor that is affecting this group in our society as well as education?
Déjeme
Let me make a few remarks that we have in the document on house life with respect to Mexico, but at the same time on how do they compare to other countries. In Mexico, 29% of all employees work 50 or more hours per week. Very long hours. If you listened to the debate at the country where we have the seat of the OECD in France, when they are currently working 35 hours per week, and where today many authorities are trying to update this number of hours because, of course, productivity in France, even though it's high per hour, the problem is that they are working few hours. So the result is not good enough. Of course, they could talk about this back and forth because it is something clearly on the table. But the intensity, the strength of the debate, the polarization of this debate, and here we are working 50 hours per week. This is something that would be unthinkable in a country like France. The average of people working these 50 hours is 12.5. At OECD, we are around 30%, 2.5 times. And so that gives you an idea. Of course, that does not have anything to do with productivity. The French work 35 hours with high productivity. They generate high product, and in Mexico we're working 50 hours with low productivity. Therefore, the generation of product is pretty modest. But there's another problem. That is that if we work more than a certain number of hours per week, we start seeing a drop in performance and the quality of life in many different ways. So working 50 hours per week is not necessarily good, and is not necessarily something that should be part of the public policy. Nonetheless, where is the best practice? Well, somewhere in between. It is clear that we have pretty much the two extremes, and so we need to find a happy medium. Now, social bonding or networking. Only 70% of Mexicans have someone to talk to. This is a very interesting piece of stats because these type of questions are not frequently asked. At the OECD, it's pretty much 90%. We might say that due to the family structure in Mexico, the response would give a higher percentage, and nuclear, more isolated families in countries in Europe or Anglo-Saxon countries might give it the result the other way around. I mean, people were expected to have greater support in Mexico. Now, 24% of people in Mexico live in areas where the content of particles in the atmosphere is beyond what is the maximum recommended by the World Health Organization. Nevertheless, the figure is not that much different as compared to OECD, because in the OECD it's a little higher than that, but not that much. I mean, we are pretty in a match point because the country is not as bad comparatively in this aspect. So does that mean that Mexico does not have an environmental issue? No, that means that environmental issues are in many places. And I should say, with great admiration, that Mexico was the first country, developing country, that set objectives for the COP21 in Paris. And it did not wait for the rest to say what they were going to do. No, Mexico took the initiative and set the pace. Mexico has an unemployment rate, a long-term unemployment rate, that is lower. This is people who have been unemployed for a longer period of time. However, it has a higher rate of informality. Therefore, the idea on whether they have employment or not is lost in the figures, because informality is so high that prevents them from having education, training, and better benefits. Of course, in terms of housing, sanitation, presence of services at home has changed. Now the ratio of what people make and spend in having their own house, and the last one I would say is that life expectancy in Mexico is 74.8 years. It increased by 9 months in the past 6 years. That's pretty much as the average of the OECD, but it has 5 or 6 years more than Mexico. Of course, then has to do, well, it's 8 years. So this, of course, reflects that there are a lot of poor people in Mexico. So this is pretty much what I wanted to say. I did not want to take that much time with this question, but this gives you a notion on how rich is the information that we have and how is it that we can compare. And the only conclusion about Mexico, since I am Mexican and since I was Minister of Finance and since of the Treasury, and since I've been in the public service for over a couple of decades, of course, we have made great progress, but at the same time, we still have a long way to go, many things yet to be done. And of course, it's a pat on the back with respect to progress, but we need to keep on working, go back to work in order to keep up with the pace of the other countries of the OECD.
One more, yes? Yes, yes. We have the microphone here, please.
Well, thank you. I am Benjamin Mora. I am responsible in Jalisco of the social development program. And what I've seen in Jalisco, and perhaps we could see that elsewhere in Mexico, is something that we are calling voluntary tourism. People who come on vacation and part of the time it contributes to aiding the civil society. We're talking about volunteer work. Is there anything that we could learn about volunteer work from experiences of people who travel for leisure, for example, because we are seeing people in Mexico, German and Iceland, young people who are spending their vacation in Mexico and working as volunteer. We're calling this volunteer tourism.
Can you hear me? Yes, there are examples like that. In fact, some countries, in particular Australia, New Zealand, have programs to attract students with special visas. These students can come to Australia, go to Australia or New Zealand, spend a year or a year and a half, and while they are there, they actually help the farmers pick the fruits, or they help or even work with a small wage in the hospitality industry. They can work for 6 months and then they have to travel around and visit the country, so perhaps spend the money, the few dollars that they've earned, and then they continue their trip around the country. So that exists as well, and that has proved to be extremely positive for the students themselves who come and work in the farms, know a different country, know a different culture, and then go back to their country with very much improved skills, and in particular language skills that they have learned in those countries. So this type of programs exist. But what we also mention in our report is in particular for the young people who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, to promote the sort of participation in voluntary activities to help elderly people, to help in the social sphere, so that again they can contribute to society in a different way, and often they earn their new skill that will allow them to integrate better in society later.
Déjeme citar.
Let me quote a note that I have. And again, of course, the young people are setting the example. More than 40% of young people older, or maybe 14 and older, at least once in the past 12 months, have being volunteers. And I wish to tell you that the average of the OECD is 30%. Well, in Mexico, our young people have this service calling as volunteers, and it is 1/3 above the OECD. We're talking about 40% in Mexico. In Mexico, we do not have figures with respect to volunteer work. We don't have information gathered. I mean, we need to work with the INEGI. We need to work with the civil society in order to gather information. So that we can take steps. Of course, this is very helpful because let me share with you something that I didn't mention before because I had time constraints and because there are a lot of tiny details. But we've measured that people who volunteer feel better. They feel better, and so when we are measuring well-being, these volunteer work or activities do not only contribute to those who are being helped, but volunteers feel better. Now, the problem is that those who typically volunteer are people who are better off, as we mentioned already. And people who are more vulnerable, they are less willing to trust others and to help others. Therefore, we have significant figure with respect to this promise. One more.
Sí, de pie, por favor.
Bueno, es de...
I come from Sin Censura, no censorship. We are an electronic means and we are present in Morelos mainly. And the question is, Mexico is like a continent. We have states like Chiapas with conditions that are similar to African countries, and we have Mexico City with countries similar to have the table of the OECD countries. At the same time, we have national law, like the federal labor law. But wouldn't it be the right thing to do in terms of public policy to have an adaptation of the law to state conditions? Because trying to have 100 million people with different types of productivities, for example, we have Nuevo León, similar to some European countries, and Baja California, and Mexico City, and Jalisco, like Chile perhaps. Why don't we have this vision on passing laws at a state level that can respond to particular needs? Because it is like a tie jacket that does not help either of the realities. And I think that this is very important. I think that this does not only apply to Mexico, perhaps Brazil, Argentina, perhaps Turkey. All these countries have similar situations, or maybe the US or Switzerland. And I'm saying this because we have conducted some studies with respect to regional development at OECD countries and non-members of the OECD emerging economies or developing countries. And sometimes small countries, geographically, 200 or 300 meters, show huge differences. I mean, we are talking about countries in the middle of Europe or where even Germany. And so regional differences are quite significant. And they all have nationwide laws applicable. However, what we cannot deny is to say that the starting point is different and that objective conditions natural resources available, of course, even the infrastructure to have access to labor markets, and the quality of health services, quality of housing, and so forth are not uniform because they were not uniform from the start. And among other things, public finances at a local level, at a municipal and state level, suggest different types of capacities to meet these basic needs. Now, what are taxes for? Well, precisely to have this cross subsidy between states, cities, and regions that have well-being and productivity levels that are higher as compared to some others, as you mentioned, like the European countries, for example, as you very well said. And with respect to the payment of taxes and social benefits and so forth, services, utilities, a number of things. Of course, they have a positive amount that compensates for the deficits of other regions, and that is done via the budget. So all the revenue is concentrated and then allocated based upon what each and everyone contributed, but also based on the needs. Some need more, and so we need to give them more so that they can keep up with the rest. And the fiscal policy is of key relevance. And when we are talking about fiscal, we are not talking about tax rates. We're talking about budgetary management, the income, the expenditure. We're not talking about social justice with taxes. We're talking about social justice with expenditure, providing people with the necessary resources. We are not talking about exemptions that benefit all and do not necessarily help those that have the least. But I would say that it is very important, and nevertheless it cannot be legislated in that direction. We cannot desire equality and legislate based on that, because it would be empty. What we need to have is to have public policies that are congruent and at the same time consistent through time, so that little by little, year and day after day, and upon providing more resources at what they have at their own region, they can start keeping up with the pace, helping them with industrial fostering policies, with company creation, with a number of things, and maybe creation of infrastructure and so forth. With respect to public policy that you very well know, then we can contribute to making pretty much all of them even. And one of the main obstacles for sustainable growth in Mexico is precisely the high degree of inequality. Latin America in general, as Enrique Iglesias said, is not the poorest region, but is the most unequal region. Unquestionably, that is an obstacle for growth.
Muchísimas gracias a todos.
So, thank you very much.
Just a reminder, all the information on How's Life is available on the OECD website. Thank you.